Gabe, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
So, can you tell myself and the audience a little bit about your background, who you are, and what you do?
Sure. So, Gabe Dimeglio, GVP and GM of what we call Rimini Protect at Rimini Street. Bottom line is that I have over the years built out a global practice of essentially cybersecurity solution and compliance solution providers. So it could be services, binaries. We do full implementations, managed services of security solutions, but they're really specifically tailored primarily to enterprise software. So ERP, CRMs, databases, web services, all that fun stuff.
And how many years? Or do you not want to say how many decades?
Right. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I'll put it this way. I've been with Rimini Street for 14 years in November. So long enough.
You're an outlier. You've been at your job for more than 2 years.
I know that is a
Maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit, not about the 14 years, but the 2 year thing. Before we start talking and dive into our topic today, the audience knows that I really want to try to destigmatize people who've been a victim of cybersecurity fraud or criminal activity and help them to know that they're not alone and they don't need to be ashamed. And so I always ask my guests, have you been a victim of a cybersecurity incident, a scam, or fraud?
yes, and of course, more than once. Let's start with the basics here. Back when cell phones were not particularly popular or out there in the market yet, it was really just technologists walking around with them, so to speak. That was my first experience. Um, I fortunately was never one that fell for like the prince from Nigeria or anything along those lines, but I did fall for a phishing campaign many years ago. Actually, it was our own though. Fortunately, when we implemented a specific solution here at Rimini Street, so that was probably 12 years ago. And the phishing methodologies that were being used by those malicious actors were not particularly advanced, really, at that
Yeah.
point. Certainly nothing like today. But the solution that we implemented actually did really have some foresight. And yeah, you get an email from the CFO that says, "Hey, I need you to go look at this thing and find out what's going on." You click on it, and boom, right? And it looked like it was from him, and it wasn't until I realized later that there's my little notification. Dink, you failed. So
Uh,
yeah.
it's amazing how much the phishing and the scams have evolved from the Nigerian fax days or the letters in the mail days. It is so much more sophisticated now.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. It's actually pretty terrifying in some ways, looking at kind of, I believe, the direction that this is headed with some of these recent technologies. Let's just be honest. I don't necessarily want to go too deep on AI. To me, it's just people are talking about it all the time. But generative AI is a problem, right? And quite frankly, um, I think that there's going to be a rapid rise in people who are compromised from the use of some of those technologies
Yeah.
until people really figure out a great way to train and educate the masses on them.
It'll be a lifelong cat and mouse game.
It will be. Yes, unfortunately.
So let's jump in. We're recording this episode in August, and not too long ago there was a worldwide critical infrastructure patch-related disaster. Let's talk about that, kid. So can you give an overview of what happened?
CrowdStrike issue, yeah. So I was in California when that happened. I live in North Carolina. And you can imagine I was a little concerned about catching my flight the next day. um, so what actually happened? So the problem really came down to some poor coding. Somehow there was effectively an update, a signature update, like if you think like a update of any antivirus rules, like historically, right? that basically contained a bunch of zeros, and there was a problem with null pointer reference. Not to get too technical, bottom line is the way that that solution is actually embedded into Windows itself, right? The agent is effectively a kernel driver, right? So, in the world space, the Windows space of the world, and this is the way we think about it in general, but from Windows perspective, yeah, you got kernel mode and user mode. And with Microsoft products, they have a great program around certification of anything that's going to interact at that kernel level. And most of the time, the vendors who develop drivers that would interact at that level naturally, like your video card driver or something along those lines, they go through these extensive certification and testing processes, and the updates are not particularly frequent. But every time that they do provide an update, they go through that same testing, and there's a certificate effectively that's issued for that kernel mode interaction, that driver. And the way that CrowdStrike works, they have the same thing. They're fully embedded into the kernel, but the software updates themselves, actually the sys files inject into that running process that's in the kernel. So the idea of having kernel mode versus user mode is that user mode gives you the space for failure. If there's going to be a code-related crash, a logic problem, whatever it may be, the user space can throw up and it splashes a nice little box that says, hey, this thing just crashed, right? Go restart it. But when you have a kernel mode driver that does that, the blue screen of death, as we've called it for years affectionately, is the best option that is out there. Basically frees everything now. And the reason being is that the risk of corruption of the rest of the data associated with those processes is too high in order to attempt to just restart the function. So the approach that Microsoft, and by the way, this affects Linux and every other platform out there too, the approach that they take is the system halts right now
Yeah.
before there's the potential for damage. So basically, their approach is injecting in the kernel. And by the way, make no mistake, it gives them great visibility into everything that the system does, right, into processes and activities that otherwise you may not have such visibility and control over. To further kind of complicate things, there's a term. It's the boot mode. There's like a bootload kernel boot mode driver, and so effectively you can't restart the platform as the full Windows operating system with that thing effectively disabled unless you go into safe mode where there's the absolute minimum
Yeah.
set of drivers. So that's what happened. And
And so one of those updates was effectively faulty.
yeah. So in fact, it's interesting because like the source code's out there on Twitter. It's been analyzed and assessed by a ton of different developers out there. Probably the best explanation, an example of it I saw was a gentleman who's retired from Microsoft who spent a lot of his career, we'll say, debugging blue screens of death, right? So, and again, there's been other, I don't know, there's been 1,000 people commenting on
Yeah.
code flaws. This has been a known. This is interesting with those code reviews. What people have found was that, oh, this thing's been broken for a long time.
Oh.
It just took this one particular straw that broke the camel's back to actually cause this event to transpire. So
Just to put it in perspective, about how many over the course of a year, how many updates or signature updates are there for CrowdStrike?
oh man, so it's several a day sometimes, right? So that's interesting. So think about this for a second. So if you look at how CrowdStrike works, they're basically sideloading these updates continually that are then processed by this kernel driver, right?
Mhm.
So it doesn't change that often because that does require going through that certification process or the testing and evaluation. So the idea is, hey, if they could sideload these updates into this thing, then it's the fastest way to get the most comprehensive protection
Yeah.
out there is kind of the thought process. Now, this is interesting because many, many moons ago, the CEO of CrowdStrike was the CTO at McAfee. They had a very similar problem back in 2012, 2013, something along those lines. But the interesting thing is that McAfee learned from that and they changed their approach. So, like, if you look at how Trellix does it today, they actually have also injected into the kernel, but all of their updates are provisioned and run in the user space. So they can provide updates multiple times a day. There's no need to go through a certification process, but those updates effectively aren't truly interacting at the kernel level the way the
Mhm.
CrowdStrike updates do. And the way that they actually roll out changes is very different than the CrowdStrike approach. Again, they learned, hey, if we roll it through North America first, out of testing, out of the QA lab, when we release this into production, they tend to do it in waves
Yeah.
around the world, and that also gives them the opportunity to identify any early indicators of a problem or compromise. Right, so it's different approaches for different organizations.
So is this the first time that CrowdStrike has had an issue that has taken out so many systems?
So many systems. Yeah, yeah. No, this is
Yeah.
this is a major problem. Yeah.
And I'm just trying to think through the math here. And how long have they been around pushing updates like this? Because we're like about 1,000 a year, let's say,
A
and
long
doing it
time.
for 10
I mean,
years.
yeah, this model. I mean, look, CrowdStrike. I remember when they were a young couple or company many years ago, and they were doing stuff that was pretty revolutionary, and they exploded, and they have captured a massive portion of market share. And it's interesting because I have a client right now that actually has been in recovery phases from a ransomware attack on some they like phishing campaign, right? So nothing we support, but it doesn't matter. Things start laterally moving through an organization, and they're running Linux, and there's a lot of I guess you could say there are a lot of options around endpoint detection and
Yeah.
response solutions or anti-malware solutions in the market for Windows-based platforms. There aren't many for Linux, and a lot of people like to say things like, "Well, that's because Linux isn't susceptible, or Windows, Unix isn't susceptible to these." That's wrong. That's not true. There are things that affect these platforms as well, as I just saw, for example. Um, but I would have historically said, "Hey, you need to look at CrowdStrike, right?" And they could utilize their capabilities there, and the answer would have been great idea. My response to them when they're saying, "Hey, we need help finding an EDR platform that's actually that we can scan these systems before we bring some of these back online," and I said, "Believe it or not, I know, you've had this conversation, but CrowdStrike's a great solution. They can't run some of the other options for various reasons." But the response was, "We're not interested in CrowdStrike right now." So that is the interesting thing we're seeing is that across the board, there's a lot of reputational damage that
Yeah.
occurred here.
And I guess my reason asking the math questions was this is one mistake out of 10,000 updates. That's a really low error rate.
Yeah, I mean, look, their track record's incredible, right? I mean, frankly, most of these security companies have unbelievable track records, but there's a saying about it. In fact, one of the leaders on my team, he tells everyone under his arm of the org, and he'll share it with anyone in our team. It's like, look, we have to get it right every single
Yeah.
time, and an attacker has to be right once. And it's true, and we kind of remind the team that on a pretty regular basis, just because it's like, hey, stay pumped up, stay motivated. We're doing some of the most important work out there, and we understand the value of it, and our clients understand the value of it, and it's good. It helps to keep people motivated to
Yeah.
remember.
So is the trade-off kind of with these platforms the speed at which the protection is put out versus the reliability or the potential downtime impact?
Yeah, so that's interesting. The reason they do this side loading, as I mentioned before, is because they can roll out these updates very, very quickly and effectively process them as comprehensively as possible across the system. That is, again, despite the track record, that is high risk to automatically apply those updates based on any vendors just go apply this update kind of
Yeah.
thing. There's testing that needs to be completed, and in the context of CrowdStrike, it's interesting because you can't just really disable auto updates. Like it's a part of the feature. In order
Yeah.
to do that, you actually have to go in and disable, like you have to manipulate the, what is it? It's the uninstall and maintenance service. So there's other ramifications that come with that. So most people just have it on auto update, obviously.
So what do people with critical infrastructure do? Okay, now we know that people are trying to get take advantage of system issues. We don't trust this major platform provider. The answer can't be, well, we're just gonna leave our systems more vulnerable.
No, the answer is test, right? Anytime you're going to introduce a change, here's the thing that's interesting, right? I've learned this through our core business at Rimini Street, which is most of this software, especially like the stuff that we support, big enterprise platforms, and they've been around for 30 plus years, and they are very, very reliable. They are very much so what you might think. It's interesting. A lot of people say, oh, well, that's legacy software, whatnot, whatever. People build integrations to them all the time. ERPs are specifically portable for that.
Yeah.
Like that's, you have that capability. Um, but this is reliable stuff that's proven. And anytime you introduce change, that's where we introduce risk. Because really, if you think about it, in general, the ones and zeros, the binaries that are running, they will continue to operate the way they're expected to. They don't wear out,
Yeah.
right? So what causes problems? You've either introduced a change of some type, or you've changed the data in a way, either way, that you've now introduced a state that it was not um, tested against, if you will, or you could say caused some kind of an issue. And we see everything under the sun, as you can imagine, in that regard. But yeah, if you change the data, that's one piece, and frankly, very rarely changing the data of a system does anything. It's generally going to be around updating how the platform
Yeah.
works, whatever it may be.
And was one of the difficulties with CrowdStrike with this particular crash and the blue screen of death is that it required hands on every single box?
Yeah, exactly. So this is kind of an interesting thing, right? So this issue requires you to boot into safe mode, remove the sys files that are associated with that update 291, whatever it was, out of the sys32 drivers folder. You have to boot into safe mode to do that. And then you turn, when it restarts, you're golden, right? And it's just because that one update. Once
Yeah.
you remove that update that's side loaded into the driver, you're good. But in general, not everyone's running KVM technologies, and I'm not talking about kernel-based virtual machines. I'm talking about the KVMs with actually wires and plugs that all of your hardware is plugged into, right? And you can SSH into a keyboard effectively and monitor, right? That's plugged into that. So that is a tool that like we use and other organizations use all the time that enables you to make changes from the boot sequence up on a box, and manage that remotely very efficiently. But a lot of organizations that are running these Windows servers that were specifically affected by this don't necessarily have that, and so it took a lot of them a long time to get people to drive to different facilities, airports, whatever,
Yeah.
and get hands on keyboard on those boxes to just roll through the change. I mean, it's a logistical nightmare, frankly.
I mean, if I think of even like the co-location where I have my servers, they do hands-on support, and that's part of the contract.
You know,
But I know there's two guys in that there's two guys in the Knox Center, and there's I don't know 50,000 servers in that building. Even if the knock is like, hey, we'll go out and do it for you, but you're number 3,000 in line. We'll get to it in 2 weeks.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's brutal, right? I mean, look, I'm gonna tell you seriously. I remember one time I was on a dark fiber project. I was doing encryption stuff, and I had to go to two IBM data centers, and one was in New York, and one was Connecticut or something, and both of them had one person there, and it was the
Oh,
security guard. That was it. Nobody else there, right? Like I'm like, these are big buildings. All the offices are vacant, and you're just like, dude, like literally, you have to come to this and do everything yourself to this facility. So what happens if your connection goes down? What happens if power problems occur and you have to go swap out equipment? There's no one to do it for you, right? It's go figure it out.
I guess I kind of wonder, was the airline industry more affected by this because now they can't get their people to the data centers to reboot the machines because the flights are delayed because they can't get people like it's a
It's amazing how these things compound on top of each
yeah.
other. When you really think about it, it's like, well, there's these dependencies. Were those accounted for in the risk assessment that was done when you actually selected these controls? Probably not.
No one thought that all the airlines are going to be down, so our people can't get to the data centers to restart the boxes that we need to fly the people out to.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's funny because now that being said, hey, look, man, I myself and several of my colleagues here at Rimini Street are pilots, right? And make no mistake, we saw some of our pilot friends out there flying people around for those exact purposes in little bitty airplanes because hey, if you've got to basically go anywhere up and down the East Coast, you can do that in a day. I mean, crossing the country takes longer, but there was a whole lot of shuttling going on.
I mean, it's really interesting that like okay, we're kind of joking about this in the with the airline sector, is that how many other sectors kind of are reliant on the same sort of thing. If there was a transportation, if there was an an update that failed in a different transportation sector,
Yeah.
it would have the same sort of the impact. And who knows, if we're not supply line specialists, how many other industries where that same sort of thing could happen, where it goes sideways, it affects everybody.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, that's the thing is in general, like I do like the fact that, you know, in my role and with our company, we're pretty much vertical agnostic. We have clients in every industry you can think of. Just about, I'll put it this way: our clients are, do you run enterprise software? Great, right? So that's our vertical. Um, but even with that, I do have such limited exposure to the day-to-day operations sometimes of these IT centers and these services. And so you think about energy sector, right? You think about gas and pipeline distribution, electrical distribution. You know, they have similar challenges, right? They have I mean, I have clients that have databases that are on oil tankers for crying out loud. And if that thing goes down, they got to fly someone out on a helicopter to meet the tanker. I mean, come on.
Or if you can, without disclosing clients and industry things, do more of those kind of, let's say, the energy verticals and whatnot, utilities, are more of their stuff offline and not connect, or what's the expression, air gapped?
Well, yeah. So anything that's critical infrastructure ideally is going to have to be segmented off on its own environment. So the way to think about it is OT, so operational technologies, all that stuff's generally going to be a separate network environment where it goes through kind of a clean environment, if you will, for testing prior to introduction into the OT environment. That's ideal. That is the way we think of things, and we want to protect them because in those environments, similar to manufacturing environments, there's a lot of old tech as far as PLCs and SCADA devices and all this kind of stuff, right? So, for example, if you're running a Windows system that does actually control a SCADA device or some series of controllers, and it gets a CrowdStrike update, and all of a sudden the machine tanks because of that, right? Well, now you're no longer controlling valves, and you're not measuring, anything around those processes anymore. So that those are kind of the areas where it's critical, and even quite frankly, let's be honest, right? You think about our military and industrial complex, right? Especially around nuclear weapons. Those systems, the circuits, they're all dedicated, isolated, completely, segmented ecosystems of technology, we'll say. What does terrify me, I don't think we're doing this on the nuclear side, but what does terrify me around manufacturing and even critical infrastructure is more and more people are effectively selling their solutions, and the solutions are cloud managed.
Yeah.
And that's dumbfounding to me. I don't understand why people are buying into that, because we see cloud breaches all the time, failures of vendors to properly configure and harden the controls that they are responsible for hardening, and putting critical infrastructure up against that, where you really do have minimal visibility into those controls, the efficacy, and everything from personnel management to you name it, right? That keeps me up at night thinking about the ramifications there. We already have enough challenges. Quite frankly, we are well aware that third party, we'll say nation state sponsored programs have basically compromised every American company that exists, right? It's like the old FBI director said, it's not, if it's not, what was he said? He said that every single company out there has been compromised, and for those that haven't, they just don't know
Yeah.
that they've been compromised. That's the reality, and
Yeah.
that's where we should be baselining those kinds of critical assets against, as far as from a protection perspective, right?
Work from the assumption that things will get compromised, and
Yeah,
what happens if these things get compromised, how are you going to manage that, as opposed to if they get compromised.
it's when, not if. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, I think I have, a couple of guests and I have talked about that and have said, have you been a victim of a cybersecurity incident? And one of the persons was, not knowingly. I'm not aware of one, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't happened. In likelihood, he was like,
Well,
yeah, it probably has happened, that I just wasn't aware of it.
yeah, yeah. I love that. It's the same thing, right? We have thousands of clients, and I tell people here and there, I'm like, it's important to distinguish that our track record, where I go, look, we've never had a client that's been compromised while under our support and security. And I got to retract that and say, okay, not the things that we were supporting in security, right? It's yes, those things do happen, and quite frankly, organizations that are very, very immature in segmentation, they always have it the worst, right? No mechanism of managing a blast radius, because they're just this big L2 flat broadcast network, and it's like, dude, that's, you don't know what a nightmare it's going to be when it happens. You need to go ahead and start figuring out how to segment these environments effectively. We just you see it here and there, and try to tell people, but you can lead a horse to water, as they say, right?
Yeah.
So
So what do you what do you tell people who run small businesses or medium-sized businesses where they don't really have a large they may not even have a dedicated security team?
I mean, come on, the amount of companies that have one dude who just wears 20 hats, right? He's like the server guy, he's the VoIP guy, oh, and security. It depends on the business they're in and what they're doing and what data is it that they have that's important. But for anyone that's that small that goes, "Hey, dude, you've been in this space forever. Can you give me some advice here?" It's like, understand what it is that you contain that's of value to anyone, yourself included. Because if you're just, one person and a dog in a shop and you're making widgets and all you're doing is taking orders and payments over Venmo here and there, maybe it's not that big of it doesn't really matter for you unless it's you are using a CAD system and you've got drawings that are there that are it's about the thing that you invented, right, where you're going to eventually get the funding to file a
Yeah.
patent for. If someone steals those CAD drawings and start making them in China tomorrow, those dreams are gone.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to figure out what's important to you and everyone else. And then you can start figuring out what you're going to do around protecting those things. But in general, when you start getting into these kind of bigger shops, right, as they start to grow and evolve, everything is just subscription based. I mean, everything out there is
Yeah.
subscription based, and so you are dependent on these vendors. Most people don't have the money to put in server rooms and all this nonsense, right? So I say nonsense because it's a lot to manage and
Yeah.
it takes people. And let's be honest, the skills gap that's out there right now is crushing most businesses, much less these smaller businesses. They can't compete financially. They can't afford the skilled workforce, right? Because they're getting paid top dollar by financial firms and basically big companies with big budgets.
So is this a good field for people to go into?
I I cannot think of a better field in the world. If you are in fact interested and intrigued with any of the various domains that exist within this space, that's the nice thing about it. If you like tech at all, it's broad and wide. I mean, as far as the different things that you can learn and work on. And quite frankly, if you come from more of a business background, it's still broad and wide on the
Yeah.
compliance and policy management and standards and auditing side. So there is something for everyone for sure. And that's not going to change as far as I can read into the future, the tea leaves ever, ever. I mean,
It's going to be a constant arms race, at least for the foreseeable future.
it is. I mean, look, not to say anything inappropriate, but I remember being at DEF CON like many years back, and it was the funniest thing. Some dudes were walking around with a shirt that says "Security, the world's second oldest profession," and it's true in one regard, but it's hilarious. But this was at a time where we were starting to see maturity in security programs finally with some form of consistency, because let's be honest, 20 years ago that just wasn't a thing,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it was
At
very,
best,
very
security was an
limited.
afterthought.
Yeah, well, I
Well,
mean, there was no way you were going to get in and have a seat at the table at the C level.
yeah.
It was challenging to say the least.
Are you finding that that is easier now in working with your clients? Is uh, cybersecurity does have a seat at the C level table now,
I'll tell you what.
or not as much as you'd
I,
like it
I,
to.
I know I can't think of a client that I've worked with in the last several years that hasn't, where cyber was not one of the highest priorities to the executives, including the board. And Gardner made a prediction. What's his name? Scott something. Anyways, it was 2023 cyber predictions, I think, around compliance. And basically, one of the predictions was that somewhere shortly after 2025, let's say, like a certain percentage of every company in the world that at least is big enough to have a board, the board will have responsibilities around cyber and risk as a part of their role and responsibility in leading the growth of that company.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing that nonstop. I can't tell you how many times a week I hear, yeah, we've talked to the board about this and we've made this, the board's approved XYZ. It's like, that is a thing that I just didn't envision happening 20 some years ago.
Yeah. Is it easier from your perspective for these companies now to, assuming they've got the profit margin, but they have a reasonable budget for cyber now?
Um, I would say that in general, security for the last couple years has been the thing that no matter what, you can get budget for it if there's a real problem that needs to be solved and it's quantifiable in the way that business leaders think and understand. So you can't just go and say, oh man, geez, we don't have this technology and someone's gonna hack us. It doesn't necessarily mean that much. I mean, make no mistake, they read the news too and they are concerned about these various hacks. But if you go to those leaders and explain that, okay, based on our risk profile as it sits right now, we have this probability that this thing could occur, and here's the impact of the business if it does. And for this investment of X dollars, I can actually lower the probability and reduce the blast radius or the
Yeah.
impact if it were to happen. And you just keep showing, here's your options. Go ahead. Here's your sushi menu. Pick an option. What would you like? Right. But here's the results. Every time you pick one of those things and these are measurable, then they understand it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that was, people were not having conversations from that perspective long ago. They are today, and as a result, as long as you do that, as long as you're having that business level conversation, you can get funding for what basically anything you need, because there is nothing more expensive than shutting down the business.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Ask Delta.
yeah. By the way, I'm going to give them props because, again, as I mentioned, I was in California and I had to get home. I have to say, those crews were amazing, and they were literally calling people on cell phones, bridging calls on cell phones, trying to figure out who's running the flight crew on a piece of paper. And the fact that they got as many flights out as they did in the time frame, like seriously, the next day when I was heading home, I was only delayed like 3 hours.
Yeah.
I mean, I just couldn't believe it. They were incredible. So, got to give them props.
When you said bridging cell phones, I'll age myself for the audience. I thought back of the days that if you had two phone lines in your house, you take the two phones, turn them speaker to mic, and hold them together. Let the two people talk to each other. Are you guys done talking yet? No. Okay.
Exactly. Exactly. It's the old party line, man.
Anybody under 40 has no idea what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but think about this, right? It's like the concept of the old party lines too, right? So basically, almost no one under 50 knows what a party, or at least if you didn't grow up in kind of a rural environment, you have no clue what a party line was.
So, as we wrap up here, any parting thoughts or advice for the audience? Or, hey, I forgot to say this and I really want to say this.
No, look, this is a great conversation. I enjoy it quite a bit. I'll say this: change control is everything. we constantly are enhancing technologies and capabilities. Digital transformation initiatives are just everywhere, right? If you're not enhancing and creating new apps and widgets, you're kind of sliding down the market share. Your competition's out there roasting you. So people are trying to understand how to balance, these investments in cyber versus enhancements to the business and new developments in social and
Yeah.
everything else. But don't ever let someone convince you to shortcut fully understanding what the technologies are and the implications of those technologies and what they can have if you were to make a change without really thoroughly assessing what is the impact to the business potentially with this change if everything goes wrong. And then what's your rollback plan, like
Yeah.
when you're making these changes. This is all kind of basic stuff, right, from kind of a change management perspective. But the fact, to me, that organizations allow anything, like we
Yeah.
saw with CrowdStrike, to just make these changes into a system that are not tested or vetted. And we see this with antivirus software every day. Like, I don't understand that. I do understand the need to get things rolled out expeditiously, but quite frankly, like, I know of organizations and businesses that have labs where those changes are pushed right to them, and as soon as they can validate functionality is good, they go ahead and they approve a process or policy. That update file is pushed, and then
Yeah.
everybody gets it. But you've got to figure out how to actually control and manage and really validate those changes appropriately. Yeah. Otherwise, you're going to end up in this exact scenario and have a lot of problems.
Yeah. So, Gabe, if people want to find you online, where can they find you?
I'm on LinkedIn. Generally, I don't do a lot of other social stuff unless you're into like hunting groups or motorcycles and airplanes and that kind of stuff. But yeah, no, in general, just find me on LinkedIn with Rimini Street, and yeah, that's about it.
Awesome. Gabe, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you. I quite enjoyed it. It's nice to be here. Thanks,
Great.
Chris.
Thank you.